This is a supplementary podcast, the topic of which is the basic identification of verbs and conditions. Before we get there, though, I'll review a lot of material that should be familiar to already, but I find that it is generally a challenge for students to master these basics, and then that this challenge then becomes an ongoing problem in the class. The first point is that there are simple sentences, compound sentences, and complex sentences in Latin. And in particular, what we're going to study when we study conditions is complex sentences. And in order to understand how these complex sentences work together, you have to be able to identify the verb basically. So that's the basic point of this entire screencast. A simple sentence can be defined by the fact that it has a subject and a verb with no subordinate clauses. It is a simple idea. It does not have any kind of a comma or a semicolon. It does not have two main verbs. It does not have two subjects. It is a simple sentence. A compound sentence joins two or more independent clauses with a coordinating conjunction like and, but, or. So look at an example of a compound sentence. Caesar was consul, and he was Pontifex Maximus. That's one single sentence, but when you break this down, it's almost like two simple sentences were joined together with the word and. Caesar was consul, he was Pontifex Maximus. You've taken two simple sentences that have a subject and a verb with no subordinate clauses and join them into a compound sentence with the word and. You could have said Caesar was consul, but he was Pontifex Maximus. Caesar was consul, or he was Pontifex Maximus. Those would all be examples of a compound sentence. The next of the three is the complex sentence. A complex sentence contains at least one dependent clause and one dependent clause and one independent clause. So the one clause depends upon the other. In the compound sentence you just saw up here, Caesar was consul and he was Pontifex Maximus. Neither of those sentences works off of the other. They're not dependent upon one another. But when you have two or more clauses joined to form a complex sentence, there's going to be some kind of coordination between them. One of them is going to be dependent upon the other. They're going to be joined by conjunctions, but not like and, but, or. They're going to be joined with conjunctions like while, when, since, although, that, in order that, something like that, because, or they're going to have a word like if. Now look at these examples of complex sentences. The first one says, I arrived in order to help. The independent clause is simply, I arrived. That would be a simple sentence in and of itself, I arrived. Then you have this other clause that says, in order that I could help, for example. I could extend that to a more elaborate example. Look at the second example. While he was sleeping, his wife was awake. His wife was awake is the independent clause because that could stand on its own. While he was sleeping sets the context for the other clause. That's the dependent one. This one could not be stated on its own. While he was sleeping is not a sentence. His wife was awake is a complete sentence in and of itself. So you take a simple sentence, his wife was awake. And then you add a dependent clause to that independent clause. You coordinate them together with the word while, and now you have a complex sentence. I'm going to resize that there, make it more complete on the screen. The next one says, Caesar was elected with the result that the people rejoiced. The independent clause is that Caesar was elected. You could put a period after that and it would be a complete sentence. Then you have the coordination where it says, with the result that. The second sentence would be, the people rejoiced. The people rejoiced because Caesar was elected. Caesar was elected, and the result was the people rejoiced. The people rejoiced is dependent upon the idea that Caesar was elected. You can see the cause and effect, or the result of the election. Letter D says, he did it so that he would win. He did it is a complete sentence. It's a simple sentence. So that joins this second sentence, he would win. That is a complex sentence with one clause, he would win, dependent upon, so that he would win, dependent upon the first one, he did it. And finally, E says, if he wins, we will be happy. That's an example that we're working with specifically today, a conditional clause. A conditional clause has the word if. We will be happy. There you go. There's your complex sentence. If he wins. The if makes it a condition. Upon the condition that he wins, we will be happy. And what we have to learn is the formulas for those various complex sentences that are called conditions. He did it so that he would win is an example of a result clause. This is another example of a result clause. This would be a cum clause in Latin. They're all different variety. This is more like a purpose clause, the first one. So that brings me to my next point, number 2. There are a number of different ways to teach complex sentences. Most textbooks approach them differently, but there's about 16 different types of complex sentence. They include the following dependent clauses: purpose clauses, result clauses, fear clauses, conditions. That's what we're learning today. The ablative absolute, direct statement, indirect statement, cum clauses, which I mentioned above. Clauses of doubting, indirect question, concessive clauses, temporal clauses, relative clauses of characteristics, circumstantial clauses, clauses of prevention. None of those are important. I just wanted to make a complete list. If you wanted to stop this video and take notes, you can. But that's not really the point. I'm just giving you a comprehensive list and pointing out to you that today I'm focusing on conditional statements. And I also want you to note that different textbooks sometimes use different names for all these different types of clauses. Since some textbooks may have more or less types of clauses that they teach in the course of a one-year Latin course. So everybody might describe Latin grammar and syntax differently, but I'm going to focus on one type of complex sentence today called a condition, or a conditional clause, or a conditional sentence. I'll use those interchangeably, but try to be consistent and call them conditions. Point number 3 is that among the most difficult clauses are these conditions. Generally, students have a great deal of difficulty with them. I think this will actually simplify things and give you a good review of what you've already seen in the textbook, while at the same time consolidating your knowledge of all verbs that you've learned. Your text so far has only taught you a small number of the different types of conditions on page 73 and on pages 109 to 110. You can stop the video right now and review those quickly if you want, but it's not necessary. The main key, the problem that students have in translating these clauses, understanding these clauses, is identifying the verbs properly and therefore being able to translate them accurately. The main problem is students do not know how to identify verbs. Now, among the very first lessons I ever taught was how to identify a verb, but I think students get lazy about it. The textbook does not emphasize this very much, and so I think students fall out of practice with it. That's where you're getting this supplemental lesson. The most important thing is to identify verbs by mood, tense, voice, person, and number. This system is in fact neglected by most textbooks, but I've been trying to include these criteria from day one. It is tedious, and so many students neglect it, so we'll review it thoroughly. Mood refers to the mode of the verb. For learning conditions at this very elementary level, you must only understand the indicative mood. Most of what you've read in the Latin textbook so far is in the indicative mood. The indicative mood is used for assertions about reality and for statements of fact. Anything that you claim is real, even if you're lying, even if you're mistaken, or even if it's only your opinion, is put in Latin in the indicative mood. For example, you can say, "It is hot." And it might in fact be 97 degrees, but to somebody else, they may disagree with you. They may think it's only mildly warm. You might think that person is insane. It doesn't matter. They're stating a fact. It is hot, or it's only warm. I went to sleep at 10 p.m. last night. Well, what if you really went to bed at 10:01? I don't know if it's factually accurate or not, but the person who's saying I went to sleep at 10 p.m. last night might be lying, might be mistaken, but they're making an assertion about reality. Abraham Lincoln was a United States president. That's a statement of fact. Not too much debate about that. That's in the indicative. Abraham Lincoln is the most important president. Many people may agree with that statement, but it's a claim, it's an assertion about reality, not necessarily a statement of fact. So any kind of assertion or claim about what's true can be put in the indicative mood. So verbs are identified by mood, and tense is the second one. Tense in the indicative mood refers to a time. There are 6 tenses in the indicative mood. That's not true for other moods. The present, the future perfect, the imperfect, the perfect, and the pluperfect. So far you've learned all of those tenses, but this is a good time to review for them, especially before your exam. To understand conditions at this elementary level, you have to understand the present tense, the future perfect, and the imperfect. Other tenses are indeed used, but they're beyond the scope of this textbook and this lesson. As long as you know the indicative present, the indicative future perfect, and the indicative imperfect, you know the mood and the tenses that are necessary to successfully translate conditions properly. Again, verbs are identified by mood, tense. Voice is the third thing. Voice refers to active, passive, or deponent. For this lesson so far, you only have to know the active voice. In the active voice, the subject performs the action of the verb. For example, if I say, "I throw the ball," I is the subject. It is doing the throwing. The subject is performing the action of the verb. If I say, "He sees the girl," forgot the word "the," he is performing the action. He is doing the seeing. He is the subject. That's in the nominative in the verb. And sees is a verb that's in, if it were in Latin, it would be described as the indicative present active voice because the subject is performing the seeing itself. So verbs are identified in mood, tense, voice, person, and number. First person singular, that's person and number. That translates in English as I. Second person singular is you. Third singular is he, she, and it. First plural is we. Second plural is you, but some people might say y'all. Just to make it simpler, I'll use that. It's not grammatically, standard English, but it's fine. And third plural is they. My point in this lesson is that students are trained to identify every verb by mood, tense, voice, person, and number. It will produce accurate translations that make learning conditions, one of the hardest type of complex sentences, much easier. The more a student drills this identification, the faster and easier it will become. Now, there are a total of at least 6 common conditional sentences that regularly appear in Latin, and that's what makes learning conditions hard. There's 6 different varieties that you have to kind of memorize or learn. 6 basic formulas. The common denominator, all of them, is that a condition begins with the word if. So of these 6 different main types of condition, and there's at least 3 others, it's called, usually mixed conditions. And again, different textbooks identify them differently. But I want you to focus on the fact that there's about 6 main conditional clauses. Every one of them begins with the word si in Latin. or they have the word see in them at some point. You can actually rearrange them a little bit. The main point you have to understand with a condition, it begins with the word if. In Latin, the word is see. I really think the best way to teach conditions is that they should be thought of as formulas with two parts. The mood and the tense, in particular, not the voice, not the person and number, the mood and the tense of the verb in the first part of the two parts and the second part of the two parts determines how the whole sentence is translated together. You have to know the mood and tense of part 1 and the mood and tense of part 2 to understand how to translate a condition. Technically, this will help us speak more efficiently. Technically, the first clause of a condition is called the protasis. The second clause is called the apodosis. Proto first, and then the after one is the apodosis. The protasis comes first, the apodosis comes second. I guess I really shouldn't call them the first and the second because you can reverse them, but generally speaking, for the sake of argument, the protasis logically kind of comes first and the apodosis comes second. You'll see what I mean when we go into actual examples. So far, what you've learned in the textbook, they refer to them as real conditions. Other textbooks often refer to them as simple conditions or general conditions. The formula, part 1 and part 2, for these conditional sentences depends upon the mood and the tense of the verbs. These are the formulas for the 3 types of conditions that you've learned in the textbook so far. You've learned 3 types of sentences, 3 examples of so-called real conditions. Remember, the formula is there's a protasis and there's an apodosis. Generally, the protasis comes first. Generally, the apodosis comes second, but that isn't always true. Okay, I've also told you that the word see has to be in a conditional sentence. Think of it as like a mathematical formula. See plus the indicative present plus the indicative present equals what you would call a real present condition. The protasis in the indicative present and an apodosis in the indicative present yields a real present condition, and it's translated in a certain way that may not always be perfectly predictable based on what you know so far. There's a little bit of changes that sometimes occur in complex sentences that deviates from what you initially learned with the translation of the present tense, for example, or the indicative mood. The second kind of condition in this category of real conditions has the word see, that means if. It has an indicative imperfect followed by an indicative imperfect, and that's called a real past condition in your book. Again, other books might call it a simple past condition or a general past condition. Doesn't really matter, we'll call it a real past condition. The third formula is the word see, which means if, an indicative future plus an indicative future gives you what you would call a real future condition. Now, there's a slight variation down here of the one we just learned, of the third, number 3 down here. You have the word see, and you have an indicative future perfect plus an indicative future. That also can be called a real future condition. You have a slight difference in the protasis, but you have the same exact apodosis. That's it. You probably don't understand why conditions are considered one of the harder lessons to teach or understand, because this is very simple. You have the word see. If it's followed by an indicative present, it'll be followed by yet another indicative present, and you describe that as a real present condition, and there's a tried and true way to translate these. An indicative imperfect is followed by an indicative perfect. An indicative future is followed by an indicative future, or an indicative future perfect can be followed by an indicative future. There's a slight variation in the formula for a real future condition. Now I'll show you some examples so you can put it into practice. Here's a real present condition, an example of one. Si id facit bonus est. The verb right there is facio, facere. Third principal part is facie. And fourth principal part is factus, facta, factum. It has the word si, which means if. Then it says if he does, it, id, bonus est. Facit is the indicative present active. It's followed by est, which is the indicative present active, and so this would be considered a real present condition. It has an indicative present plus an indicative present. And you translate it just like you would expect to translate it. If he does it, that's the present tense. He is good. Is the present tense. Look at the second example. Si auxilium optamus, te vocamus. If, si, optamus, we want auxilium help, te vocamus. Vocamus means we call you. Optimus is in the indicative present active. Vocamus is in the indicative present active. The verb in the protasis is the present tense. The verb in the apodosis is the present tense. When you have a present tense in the indicative mood followed by a present tense in the indicative mood, you call that a real present condition. And you translate it as, if we want help, we call you. Couldn't be any simpler, and yet students generally have a lot of trouble with this. Next example, real past condition. Si ed faceret. Now we've used the third principal part. Si id facerat bonus fuerat. If he had done it, he had been good. Here I give you an example where you have a past tense followed by a past tense. You have the indicative pluperfect followed by the indicative pluperfect. That's not even the example I gave to you, but I wanted to throw this one in here so you'd be flexible enough to realize that the real past tenses, often called the simple past conditions, one follows the other. Just like an indicative present follows an indicative present, here's an indicative pluperfect followed by an indicative pluperfect. You translate the pluperfect as had done and had been. Look at the next example. This is the one I told you about. It's covered in the text. Si auxilium optabant, me vocabant. This is the imperfect indicative, and this is the indicative imperfect. It has the word si, which lets you know it's a condition. It says, if we used to want help, we used to call, they used to call me. Sorry, if they used to want help, they used to call me. That's an imperfect followed by an imperfect. Both are in the indicative mood, both are in the imperfect tense. That's called a real past tense. You could also have that in the perfect, or as in the first example, the pluperfect. Here's your two varieties of the real future. First one says, si id faciet. Since this is a third I, the future uses E. So it says, if he will do it, he will be good. That's an indicative future active followed by an indicative future active. It could have been an indicative future passive followed by an indicative future passive. The voice doesn't matter in this case. I mention it for the sake of completeness, but it's not part of the formula. The formula requires you to have an indicative of one tense followed by an indicative of the same tense. It couldn't be more simple. Again, that's why lots of people call these simple conditions. Look at the second example. Si auxilium optabimus, te vocabimus. If we will want help, we will call you. Lots of times, proper English requires you to translate this technically as shall, so the books will print shall, but I don't think people really use shall that much anymore, so I'll speak it more colloquially. If we will want help, we will call you. That's an indicative future followed by an indicative future. Here's another good one. Ceopitium caperimus poetae nostra facta canent. Now in this case, it's the kind of alternative version. That's an indicative future perfect tense followed by an indicative future. That's the alternative. Technically, that says, if we will have captured the town, the poets will sing of our deeds. But often people just block out that, as I've put in brackets here. If we capture the town, the poets will sing our deeds. Technically, the future perfect, though, is translated as, if we will have captured the town, the poets will sing our deeds. And here's an example from a real poet, Ovid, in real Latin, not, kind of baby Latin like your textbook. It says, if you will have given to me these prizes, I will be a soldier. Ero miles. This is the indicative future perfect, followed by ero, which is the indicative future. And I went through that very quickly because all of it should be review. But I want to point out and summarize everything now is that what I was trying to get at in my review of verbs and moods is a lesson on conditions. To understand conditions, you have to know that they're a type of complex sentence, and there are a variety of them, 6 total. I only taught you today the categories called real conditions. There are, some people call these simple conditions or general conditions. But there are also contrary to fact conditions, contrary to fact. There are also future conditions like future more vivid and future less vivid. They're not that interesting, just a side note for today. So you've learned the different types of real or simple conditions today. And the reason you've learned that is that students often have trouble with it because they don't really drill themselves with the mood of a verb. They generally know the tenses pretty well, but they generally neglect the mood and don't think about it that much. Real conditions require that you understand the formula of a condition. The formula of a condition has to begin with the word if, which is see in Latin. The next thing in a real condition is that you'd have a tense, like the indicative present. If you have the indicative present, it must be followed by the indicative present. It's that simple. That's why they call them simple. And then you translate it very simply with like 2 present tenses in the indicative mood. The next kind of clause, that would be a real present. The next kind of clause is the word see plus an indicative imperfect or any tense of the perfect, any tense of the past tense, plus another indicative imperfect. That's all the book limits you to. That's a real past condition. Real present has 2 present tenses in the indicative. Real past has 2 past tenses in the indicative. And finally, there is see plus an indicative future or an indicative future perfect. It doesn't matter. In Latin, they use them somewhat interchangeably. Plus an indicative future. You can't have the indicative future perfect in the second clause. That's a real future clause. The protasis can be the indicative future or the indicative future perfect. The apodosis has to be the indicative future. You've learned these lessons about conditions many weeks ago, so it's a good time to review these. And you learn the identification of verbs by mood, tense, voice, person, and number at the very beginning of the class. So 2 good reasons to review this material. Call me or Skype me if you have questions about this. You'll take a little quiz to see that you've mastered and reviewed this, and this will no doubt help you for your upcoming exam.